What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? Was working the evening shift at a gas station. Man comes in all disoriented. I go to help him out. He has a gash on his head and doesn't know where he was. I couldn't see any crashes around, so assumed he had fallen or something. Normally we are supposed to stay inside the glass-shielded register area whenever anyone is in the store. I, being a nice human being, went to help while calling the police EMS. They got there and checked him out. They thought his head may have been fractured. Took him to the ER. I went back to work. Cops stopped back by for some coffee a few hours later. They told me the guy got hit by a baseball bat trying to break into a little girl's bedroom and was wanted for rape and murder in 2 other states. I never left the register area at night again. Kudos to the slugger that hit him. The Lake Nyos disaster. The lake periodically belches a cloud of invisible carbon dioxide gas that suffocates everything within a 16-mile radius. In 1986, over 1,700 people and all their livestock died without even understanding what was happening to them. My science teacher in high school was in the Peace Corps and one of the first people to come across this village after it happened. He said it was so eerie because all the flies and mosquitoes had died and it was so silent. Well, I'm a bit late, and I'm not sure if anyone posted this already, but the story of Hisashi Aochi. He suffered radiation exposure so thorough his DNA was destroyed, and he probably would have died in a matter of days or even hours, but doctors kept him alive for almost 3 months. He was conscious and begging for death as his body literally fell apart. Well, basically, he spilled some type of chemical on him. At first weeks, he was fine but was already in the hospital because it was dangerous. Then he progressively got worse. His body started swelling and eventually his skin started falling off. He had no identifiable chromosomes either, so his whole genetic DNA was changed. He was in a research center, so many scientists and doctors were there to see what would happen when humans came in contact with that chemical. So he was an experiment. Eventually a fluid started building up in his lungs. They pierced them but it didn't do much, so they stuck a tube down his throat. His last words were, "I'm in pain, I'm suffering." His whole body looked like he was burned and eventually all his skin came off. His organs were failing, his insides ruptured. He had intense diarrhea. He was losing a lot of fluid and every time, the doctors would give him more to keep him alive. And he was conscious for like 2/3 of the whole thing, making noises when touched, crying, etc. Before it got worse, as he showed barely any symptoms when exposed, he used to beg for his mom and for them to let him sleep for at least one night. He eventually stopped talking due to the tube. And he eventually stopped feeling. No one knows for sure if he still was conscious/had brain activity, but the skin around his eyes made it so his eyes were always open. I'm pretty sure he only responded to light by his pupils dilating. They obviously started questioning whether or not it was morally correct for them to continue experimenting on him, but they did for like another month. This is where he was in total organ failure, yet they still kept him on life support/dialysis. His heart stopped 3 times in one day and they still kept going. They stopped after his family signed a DNR on the 81st day, and by day 83, he had finally died. They also administered experimental drugs to him to see how he would respond. He was being used by the researchers as a human guinea pig. An acquaintance of mine sent his son to triathlon camp in Texas. A week later, his son came back from camp. The next day, the son was complaining of a headache. 4 days later, he was dead. Healthy, happy, fit 12-year-old, 1 week, dead the next. Turns out the lake had Naegleria fowleri, the brain-eating amoeba. Nothing scares me as irrationally as already being dead and waiting for your body to catch on. Naegleria is terrifying to me. You can get it just from getting water up your nose swimming in a lake, or, I've heard but am too lazy to check, there have been people who got it from using a neti pot. 3 sailors survived the sinking of the USS West Virginia at Pearl Harbor, only to die 16 days later, due to the lack of air. The Navy knew they were there, but couldn't get to them. 16 days to die. Tough to pick just one because there is true evil in humanity out there. Stuff like the Blood Eagle ritual is pretty awful. But in terms of really scary, probably stuff that just kind of happens on accident. Like the story of Kyle Plush. Just awful. He was in a minivan that has one of those back seats that you can push backward to lay flat in the trunk for extra storage space. He went to grab something in the trunk, leaning over the seat, and it tipped backward and pinned him, upside down, against the back of the car in a position such that he couldn't get himself out. He called the police twice. The second time he called and gave them a very clear description of the car. Plush called 911 again at around 3:35 p.m. Police said this time he provided a description of the vehicle as he desperately pleaded for help but couldn't hear the dispatcher. Isaac said the information didn't get relayed to officers at the scene. "This is not a joke," the teen said over 911. "I'm almost dead." He asked the dispatcher to tell my mom I love her if I die. Just a horrible, random accident that could have happened to anybody. This kid didn't go looking for trouble, like he didn't try and go down a chimney or go caving like other people who have gotten stuck and suffocated. He was just reaching for something in his trunk, got pinned, and then was not found in time. Nightmarish for the kid and his family. I still don't get why the hell they couldn't have gotten to him in time. His parents have filed a lawsuit over this, because honestly, there's no reason that child should have died as long as he was on that phone with 911. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult, by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother, and was by some reports involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with the carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming into 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself, and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. How do people do stuff like that? My grandfather was an engineer/architect for U.S. Steel through the early 70s. One day a coworker who was getting divorced brought his young son and young daughter for a tour of a steel mill. Proceeded to bypass the admittedly lax security of the 60s, picks up his kids and jumps, with them, into some molten steel. People that kill kids are horrifying, but parents who kill their own kids, Jesus. My brother's ex-GF had 2 older sisters, they died before she was born. One day they decided to play hide and seek or something, so anyway, they both climbed inside a chest and accidentally locked themselves in. They suffocated. I'll tell you one that happened to me, or rather, I was witness to. One night, I was out at a bar with a friend I was visiting in New Rochelle, New York. We went outside for a cigarette, and a car came flying past the bar. The car burned through a red light, and started going up this hill that was on a curve. We watched as he veered over the double yellow, and smashed head-on with another car coming from the other direction. Both cars' hind ends lifted up, then slammed down. The car that was driving correctly burst into flames. I ran inside and grabbed the fire extinguisher, then yelled to the bartender to call 911 and say there has been an accident. My friend, a few other patrons, and me ran to the cars. Now, I used to think this was a fictional trope, but I was pretty drunk before this happened, and I swear it sobered me up instantly. I tried spraying the fire, but it did nothing. The fumes and heat were awful, and all we could do was stand back. The worst part was, and this will haunt me forever, was that the woman in the burning car was screaming as she died. My God, it was the worst sound ever. The fire department came and put the fire out. The police took us back to the bar and took statements. I found out the next day in the news, that the car that was not speeding was being driven by a young woman coming home late from work. She was a block away from home, and I think she was either newly married or a new mother. The rotten mother effer driving the other car was some rich drunk idiot. He lost a leg, but otherwise was physically unharmed. I have no clue if he did time, as I left to go back home a day or so later. I'm trying to find a link for the news story, but I can't, as this was maybe 6 or 7 years back. I remember it being reported on Low HUD and Channel 12 News. Nutty Putty Cave in Utah was sealed up in 2009 after John Jones was trapped upside down in a small crevice while spelunking. When rescue teams finally arrived, he had been upside down for so long that his legs were drained of blood. The only possible way to have gotten him out was to break his legs, which would have sent him into fatal shock. He died after being trapped for 28 hours. His body's still in the cave. The story of Mary Vincent always stands out to me. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally raped her, and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed, and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch/ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. What really upsets me most about this is that Singleton was released from jail for good behavior and went on to murder a different woman a few years later, Roxanne Hayes. Well, he hasn't chopped any arms off or raped anyone in the last 2 years while in jail, so he is pretty much good to be released early. What the F were they actually thinking? There was a woman who worked in a science lab who spilled 2 drops of organic mercury on the back of her gloved hand. Those 2 drops destroyed her entire nervous system and brain. On September 20, 1987 in Bellingham, Washington, a Georgia-Pacific paper mill worker was sent to inspect a heat exchanger system in the steam plant. Inside the base of the stack, he spotted a charred skeleton. To this day, no one is certain who the victim was, how they wound up in such a horrible place, nor why. The Toy Box Killer and his transcripts. If you absolutely want to have your day ruined, this has to be one of the most disturbing, creepiest things ever. Serial killer David Parker Ray would play these tapes for his victims, so they had an idea of what was coming and to also mentally break them. Hear the start of one tape to give you an idea. Hello there, B. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained. Gagged. Probably blindfolded. You are disoriented and scared, too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal, under the circumstances. For a little while, at least, you need to get your crap together and listen to this tape. It is very relevant to your situation. I'm going to tell you, in detail, why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you and how long you'll be here. I don't know the details of your capture, because this tape is being created July 23, 1993 as a general advisory tape for future female captives. Can you imagine how terrifying it would be to wake up in a place you didn't know and have someone play these tapes for you telling you what horrible things were going to happen to you before you died? This may just horrify me more than others. Dude was working on a tuna steamer and they closed him in and steamed him. I can't help but imagine that is anything but a truly terrifying and painful way to die. One of the main reasons I never could bring myself to do real factory labor, is because I don't trust people enough to not tuna steam me. Edit, thanks for the gold. R.I.P. Jose Molina. During World War II, an American airplane crashed near the Japanese island of Shikijima. There were 9 servicemen on board. 1 was rescued by an American submarine. The other 8 were taken in by the Japanese. Don't want to go into all the details, but through some time and events, the Japanese ended up eating those servicemen. But that's not the weird part. The one serviceman who was rescued? That was George H.W. Bush. Google Shikijima incident for more details if you'd like. A guy I worked with was riding his dirt bike through the woods and somebody hung a cable between 2 trees. My buddy caught his throat on it and saw the dude steal his dirt bike. Woke up in the hospital with a lacerated throat and a broken larynx. Pretty crazy what somebody will do for something so cheap. A pub in Cranbrook, Berkshire in UK has a pretty terrifying history. The Ostrich has seen its fair share of murders and they say that over 60 were committed here. Most famous of all were those committed in the 17th century by the landlord of the time, Jarman, who with his wife made a very profitable sideline by murdering their guests after they had retired for the night. They had a trapdoor built into the floor of one of their bedrooms, And when a suitably rich candidate arrived, Jarman would inform his wife that a fat pig was available if she wanted one. She would reply by asking her husband to put him in the sty for till the morrow. The bedstead was hinged and they would tip the sleeping victim into a vat of boiling liquid immediately below, thus killing him. I've posted this before, but when I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team. Typical social team, out for beers and pizza after with the guys, family event type thing. My parents were good friends with two of the other couples, both of them had young kids as well. On this occasion, the other two couples had left their kids at one of their houses, with a babysitter they were splitting. They invited my parents back to the house to have some more beers that night, but I was being fussy and my mom nixed the idea, though they would 100% have normally gone back to hang out. Well, it turned out my fussiness on that day saved our lives. When the other parents got back to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. Two men had broken in, tied up the kids and the babysitter, and her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents. Took the parents hostage as well, and made the dads drive with them to banks/a grocery store where one dad was manager and clear out account/a safe. They then came back to the house, and slaughtered both families, the babysitter, and her boyfriend. Kids included. They caught the two guys later on. My dad attended the trials, and said it was the first time he had ever had thoughts of supporting the death penalty. It still gives me chills to know how close we came to getting killed that day, too.